Perfect. We are now live. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us at the second event of our lecture series on the data economy. For those who weren't here at the first lecture, my name is Abby Adams-Prassel. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics, and I'm associate head of department with responsibility for research impact and external engagement. And so this year we've joined forces with the Oxford University Business Economics Programme to create a series of lectures given by department alumni on the key economic issues at play in today's data economy. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome Ole Jann, who is an assistant professor at Charles University in Prague, and who was previously a postdoctoral research fellow at Nuffield College here in Oxford. He has a large number of publications on the economics of privacy and on information economics, and right on topic is also the principal investigator of a Junior Star Project on data, algorithms and power, economic theories of the information society. And so now today, Ole is going to be telling us about the economics of privacy. As we all know, some of the world's largest companies are built on selling their users' data, and most of us regularly give away personal data in exchange for free or at least better services. And so today we're thinking about what are the economic effects that this has for the individual and for society. How do we think about regulation in this space? And considering the kind of these practical issues, also is going to provide a bit of a platform for Ole to tell us a little bit more about the wider economics of information that this relates to. Okay, so please do write your questions down in the Q&A as the talk progresses, so that we've got a kind of a nice stock of things when we get to the Q&A after Ole's talk. Right, over to you, Ole, the floor is yours. Thank you again for sharing your insights with us.
All right, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you, and thank you all for joining. I assume that you can hear me. Otherwise, Abby would signal to me now, but she can hear me. Very good. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. My name is Ole Jann. Let me put on my slides for today. They are here. So I will be talking about the economics of privacy. By the way, if at some point I say privacy, at some point I say privacy, they are the same thing. It's just that the English language can be confusing, right? So let me start by saying what is the big question that I want to talk about today, right? And the big question is, should we care about privacy? And we all know these examples, right? So we all know, every day your smartphone is sending several megabytes worth of data to Google or Apple, and your browsing behavior is collected, and your purchases and location are tracked, and so on. None of that is news. If we follow the news, we all know that. We've known that for years. So I think the real question is, should we care about that? Do we care about that? And if we care about that, what should we do? Okay, and on the one hand, what should we do as individuals? What happens with my data? How does that affect me? And also as a society, and that's really where the economist comes in, right? When we say, who can do what with private data? Who does that affect? And who should have which data, right? So how should we think about regulating that, or how should we think about approaching that question? And so I have a sign here that has popped up in different places around the world that says, Google now hiring, no need to apply, we already have all your information, right? So, and funnily enough, while I was searching for that sign on Google, of course, I found that there's the exact same joke about Facebook. So that just shows, these are two of the most valuable companies in the world, and their whole business is built on owning your data, processing your data, and getting you every day to produce more data for them. And so I want to start with a very strong statement that, all of you will have heard, and some of you might actually agree with that statement. And then we'll gradually kind of confront that statement and maybe chip away at it a little bit throughout the talk. And that statement is the so-called nothing to hide argument, right? Which basically goes in its simplest form, something like, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. So why should you care about privacy? The only reasons to care about privacy is because there's something illegitimate, right? So if you have something to hide, you should not be able to hide it. And so I have a quote here that says, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Except that quote doesn't come from Xi Jinping. It actually comes from Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google when he said that, right? So if you're using Gmail or Google Maps, Android smartphones, and so on, that is the kind of attitude that has gone into a lot of the infrastructure that you're using. And so this is an argument that we hear a lot. That is an argument that is made by tech companies, by security services, maybe also by family members or by, suspicious spouses or whatever. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, you should just willingly reveal all your data, and you should not cry over any data or any privacy that you give up. And what I want to ask, and what I really kind of want to do here, is to ask, is this a useful way to think about the issue? And can we perhaps find more useful ways from economics to think about this issue? So in this talk, I'll try to give you some economic insights into privacy problems. And I'll focus really on this question: how should we think about this? What are good ways of thinking about this? So the goal of this talk, or the goals of this talk, is maybe at the end you'll see some issues a bit more clearly. Maybe something where you had a bit of a fuzzy idea, you now see what is important or what isn't important. And maybe even, of course, that's the maximum goal, maybe you reconsider a view you've held. And I will focus mainly on theoretical ideas, because I really believe in this dictum from Levin, who said there's nothing more practical than a good theory. Right? Because to understand this data economy, of course, we need a lot of data. Of course, we need to do a lot of empirical work. But in the end, the big question is, how should we think about that? What are actually the trade-offs? And what are actually the incentives that people face? And what are actually the implications for inequality and things like that? And for that, we need some theoretical ideas. What I'll do is I will tell very simple stories to illustrate these ideas. But that is what we do as economists, right? So in a research talk, I would be showing you mathematical models, but that's just stories expressed in mathematics, right? So by the way, if you're one of my research colleagues and you're seeing this talk, don't go home thinking like this guy has really come down in the world, a whole talk and no formula. There are formulas. I want to try to tell you the important things here with just using very simple stories. And you might think that some of these stories are a bit silly, or maybe they depict something that would be illegal or immoral anyway or so. But these are really just stories to tease out one or two important mechanisms that I want to talk about. So privacy, and when I talk about that, for economists, that's really mainly a question of information. Okay, so who can observe what you do? Who can collect or process or use data about you? And an important concept there is the information asymmetry, okay? So that someone has more information than someone else, and privacy is precisely such an information asymmetry, saying that you have your data, but other people do not have this data about you. And so if you take nothing else away from this talk, maybe, in a few weeks, you sit in a meeting and you can raise up your arm and you can say, I think we're facing a problem of information asymmetry here. And everyone will nod very thoughtfully and agree with you. And so that's already something accomplished, right? So one way to accomplishment, having easy goals. Okay, so there are, of course, other definitions. So privacy can be the right to be left alone, can be the boundary between world and self. I really want to focus on the informational issue here. And also because economists have been studying information and information asymmetries for decades. So this is something where we can actually contribute something. There are, of course, many practical questions. How should I use the internet? How should companies be regulated? Should we own our own private data? Should there be a market for every type of data, or maybe not? And so on. I really want to talk about, how should we think about these issues? And I'll be using some classic economic concepts. So if you have ever studied economics, or maybe you're studying or doing economics now, you will recognize a lot of these concepts. So incentives, of course, trade-offs. I'll talk a little bit about adverse selection, moral hazard, without actually naming them. And of course, then we come to the bigger economic questions, which are welfare of the whole of society and also inequality, right? Who is better or who is worse off with privacy. So I'll talk a little bit about why should we care as individuals and as society. Then I'll talk about, can the market solve this? A very obvious question for an economist, and something where we might get, interesting results or ideas. And then, sorry, spoiler alert for the question about the market, I'll also talk about how much regulation might we need, because I'll show you that there are some situations where the market is actually, we wouldn't expect the market to do very well these kind of problems, because markets and information, that's often a bit of a tricky pairing. So we all care about privacy sometimes. I think that's obvious to you. Bathrooms have doors and locks, windows have curtains, especially in the UK, if I remember correctly. Of course, when we send text messages, to good friends or our spouse or whatever, we often double check, that we send it to the right person, because we don't want that kind of information to get to someone else. And even though people do share a lot of information online, there are still a lot of people who have boundaries, right? So about 40% of users, we don't know exactly, but around 40% of users do not share their relationship status on Facebook, for example, right? It's a surprisingly low number for me, but it's still a substantial number. And this can have just intrinsic reasons, okay? It can just be that you just like having privacy and you just don't want anyone to know this. And as economists, we take such preferences seriously, right? So we say, we don't say you have wrong preferences or so, we just say that it is what it is. We should take that seriously. We should measure that, and we should try to respect that, or we should put that into our welfare considerations. But there's something slightly more interesting, which is that privacy can, of course, have instrumental reasons, okay? Your preference for privacy is motivated by your fear that your data could be used against you, or that you could have to pay more, right? So personalized pricing on Amazon and so on is a big topic. Or you think, maybe your job application will be rejected because of something you have done on social media, or some data that Facebook has collected about, how much you party or something like that. And so what we see on the individual level is actually a privacy paradox, okay? So many surveys actually show that people care about their privacy and they want privacy, but they also do not seem to take even very small steps to increase their privacy, okay? So for example, change privacy settings in Facebook and so on. So why is that? We're still not entirely sure, right? So this is kind of an open question in economic and in social science research. So if you're a student just getting started on this, this is an interesting question to look into, right? Because we're still not entirely sure that we understand that. But of course, this is also an empirical issue, right? So how much do people intrinsically care about privacy? And it's also an issue for education and media, right? So do people understand how their data can be used? So let me point out an interesting observation here. So in Europe, Facebook makes around 40 pounds of revenue per user per year. So this is very rough, and this is, of course, an average. And when I give talks like this, I often ask the audience, would you be willing to pay that amount if in exchange Facebook could not use your data? And usually a lot of hands go up, usually much more than 50%. But there's, of course, two things here, right? One is that, let me just point out the one main thing. The main thing in here is, of course, that the people I asked that, they might be the ones with very, very valuable data, right? So this might not necessarily be informative. The other point is, of course, that again, we have a privacy paradox, because then if I ask people, have they taken very simple steps to protect their privacy on Facebook, they have often not done that, okay? So maybe their time is so valuable that, using 3 minutes is worth more than $40 per year or so. But so this is already an interesting question that we can ask. But let me talk a little bit more about privacy and society. Okay, so now we've understood individuals have reasons to care about privacy. They might have just intrinsic reasons. They might have instrumental reasons. But let's talk a little bit more about the impact that has on society. So imagine that there is a very divisive issue. So let's say Brexit. So by the way, it's funny. This is remote and all your microphones are muted, but I could swear I heard someone say, "Oh God," when I just brought up Brexit. So yes, here it is again. So everyone is discussing that on social media and has been, and to some extent still is. And now think of the following. So this is a story that I'm telling you, right? A story to tease out some important mechanism that I think we should understand. So think of an employer who is hiring and who thinks that, applicants who have Polish sounding names, who criticize Brexit on social media, they might be more likely to leave soon, right? Because as an employer, you're always thinking about like, how long will these people stay with me? So in this case, the employer decides to screen applicants' social media activity, right? To just kind of Google or just search them on Facebook and Twitter and just see what they're doing. And we know that employers do that, right? So there's both scientific studies, but there's also surveys that show that, for example, 50% of employers say about themselves that they have previously rejected applicants because of their social media activity. And what this creates is, of course, a chilling effect, right? Which is that some people will become more careful about their social media posts, their social media activity, especially while they're job hunting. And I think if you've been recently job hunting and you were kind of considered for very high-paying jobs or so, where a lot of money goes into the selection process, you have probably had that thought at some point or the other, right? So kind of what does your social media activity say about you? So this chilling effect is there, and we also know from studies that people engage in that actually. So let's think about what actually happens with that chilling effect, right? So because we said here that this especially applies to people with Polish sounding names. Okay, so this is a slightly artificial example, but I don't think it's completely unrealistic that employers think differently depending on what your name sounds like, right? So for people with English sounding names, we wouldn't really expect much of an effect here, right? Because they kind of feel free to talk about Brexit. They don't expect that the employer would expect that it changes their willingness, how long they're staying in the country or something like that. For people with Polish sounding names in this example, well, they cannot use social media exactly the way they want to, right? Because they have to be careful a bit because they don't want to jeopardize their chances of getting the job. And then for society, of course, what happens is that debate is then automatically skewed because some opinions from within one group, opinions from among the people with Polish sounding names, who might have lived in Britain for a long time, some of their opinions are missing from the public debate because they're holding back in order not to do anything to their chances of getting the job. But the last piece of the puzzle, so you can always say, and often people approach this and say, okay, yeah, so without privacy, with data being shared and so on, some people are worse off, but in the end, it increases the precision of the decisions that are made. Okay, so they would argue here that the employer actually can make better decisions if they have more information while they make the hiring decision. But what happens, of course, is that for the employer, social media activity is actually not that informative if the people I really care about are changing their behavior to look more bland and kind of less risky on social media. And so let's look at these 4 effects to 4 different groups and say, okay, so for the individual with English sounding names, there's not really a loss or gain here, right? So not directly, at least. They still get the job. They still do on social media what they want, at least in this respect. For the individuals with Polish sounding names, they are clearly worse off because they cannot use social media the way they want to. Society is also worse off because of this skew in the debate, right? So the information aggregation that we want to happen in society, where people bring their opinions and they discuss and they learn from each other and so on, some of that is not happening here because people are holding back because they are afraid of their chance of getting a job. But finally, the employer actually doesn't have a large gain either because the social media activity they're looking at is done by people who are already kind of cowed into trying not to say anything offensive. So actually, all these 4 effects mean that if it becomes possible for employers to use this social media data in this example, makes no one actually better off, right? So it makes some people worse off, and for some people, it gives no loss or gain. For the employers, it gives at most a very small gain, right? Because they gain very little information from this social media activity that you can see. And we can also see that there's a minority group here, which is the people with Polish sounding names. They lose the most, right? Because they have they have to self-censor their activity, but also their voices are less represented in public debate. And so they're hit by several effects at the same time. So again, this is just a story, right? I'm not saying this is what happens in reality. I'm not saying this, explains everything, but this is just to tease out what are the effects that are happening here, and who is better off or who is worse off if we take away people's privacy. And even those who are not directly affected lose through the deterioration in debate rights. Okay, if public debate gets worse, if information aggregation in public debate gets worse, that in the end that will impact everyone, right? Just like getting rid of free speech might benefit some people in the short run, but in the long run would be detrimental to society. So what we can see is that privacy has implications beyond the individual, right? So it's not just the people here who are applying for jobs who are gaining or losing from having privacy. There are actually implications beyond that, and in the end for the whole of society. And so giving people privacy, so for example, in this case, guaranteeing in some way or another that job applicants' social media data will not be used for the job decision, can actually make everyone weakly better off. So this weakly better off, that's kind of an economist term that means everyone is at least as good or better off, right? So weakly better off. So it's not just redistributing between different groups. So people often think of privacy as something that, if you give someone privacy, they have more control over their data, but someone else can learn less about them. And so we're redistributing something between different groups. But we can see here that that's not what's happening, right? So we're actually, we are kind of making some people much worse or much better off, but we're actually, all of the effects are pointing in the same direction. But still we can see that lack of privacy hurts some groups more than others, right? And so this is another important lesson that I think we can take from, again, very simple stories like that questions of privacy, they are also questions of distribution and inequality. Right? And so in our example, it was the people with Polish sounding names who, a large part of them tend to be Polish citizens who are hurt or who are hit more by the question or affected more by the question of privacy or not here. Okay, so now that we've understood this, and I think we'll do questions mainly in the end, and I'm of course happy to talk about any aspect of it. But once we've understood and either we agree with this, or at least we've kind of understood what I'm trying to maybe say with this story, the natural question for economists is, can markets solve this? Right? Because as economists, we really we do believe that free exchange and giving people the chance to make choices for themselves can often be a good way to solve any of these kind of problems, and that also a regulation can have different effects on different people. The regulation can hurt some people more than others, but also, of course, regulation can just be badly made. Right? So I think we've all lived under governments where we can kind of agree with that sentiment. So can the market solve this? So there's a very popular idea about this, which is also being discussed in talk shows and so on, which is that we should just give people ownership of their data. And that sounds like an idea that really cares about people, but on the other hand, it's quite a liberal idea, right? It's an idea that basically says we just need to figure out the ownership rights and then everything else will sort itself out. So the idea is just give people ownership of their data, and then they can just choose freely whether to sell their data and to whom, right? So it's not like Facebook and Google just take your data for free while you browse. You could actually choose who can use your data and can ask for money for that and so on. And so the reasoning there is that free exchange makes everyone better off, right? So if people value their privacy more than the price they are offered for their data, they just keep their data, fine. And otherwise, if they say, I'd rather have the money than have this data, people can just have this data, no problem. If I get some money for it, they just sell the data. So from that simple argument, it would seem like no one should be worse off, right? The question is that really the case? And so then let me tell you another story. And again, we're talking about applications. And again, it's a very kind of striking, kind of weird story. But again, I'm trying to get to one specific point here. So think about an employer who does not want to hire married people. We can all kind of think what kind of job that might be, maybe late hours and you have to be flexible or whatever. But marital status is not on people's CV. Okay, or at least, in modern times, most people don't have that on their CV. So she has a very clever idea. She just, walks into the room where all the applicants are waiting, and she says, I will pay $10 to everyone who truthfully reveals their marital status. Okay, so people just, can just show something in their ID card or whatever that shows that, for the sake of this story. So this is great, right? Because people are given property rights in their own data here. Everyone can freely choose whether to share that data or not. But what do we expect will happen here? Well, on the one hand, there are unmarried people who say, this is great, right? I can just I can just tell them I'm unmarried, I get $10, and I increase my chance of getting hired because I know they tend not to hire married people for these jobs. On the other hand, married people, they're not happy to take this offer, right? Because they know that revealing this lowers their chances of getting the job, and the job is worth much more than $10 to them. But that choice in itself reveals that they are married, right? So in the end, if only the unmarried people reveal their marital status, it's as if the married people have revealed it as well, because those are the ones who have not revealed anything, who have not taken up the offer. So in economics, we call this kind of an unraveling argument or an unraveling logic, because even if we start with a state where no one gives up their data, then some people find it kind of fine or a good idea to give up their data, and then gradually more and more people give up their data until in the end, information about everyone basically gets revealed. So we should realize here that the damage to the married people who are unable to get the job, that might be a lot larger than the benefit to the employer, right? Because the employer might have some small preferences about it, but for married people who are unable to get this kind of job, this is really a big problem. And I'm just talking about here, like economic benefits and economic costs and so on. This is still separate from the moral aspect of whether this kind of discrimination is right or wrong, right? And people have very strong views about that, but I'm just focusing on the economic question here. So in this example, we tried giving people control of their data. We tried giving people property rights of their data. We told them, you don't have to sell your data, you only have to sell the data if you like the price. And we saw that didn't really solve the problem. Still, in the end, all of the data was revealed, and especially it was revealed also for people who didn't want to reveal it and who didn't get any money for it, right? Because the married people, they didn't get any money and still revealed that they were married by not revealing their data. And so actually, in reality, of course, many of such questions are illegal in job interviews or in rental applications and so on. And that's partially for the moral reasons, but also partially for some of these unraveling and economic reasons. So the bigger picture is that not selling data is informative. You reveal information without getting compensated because other people are selling their data, and that reveals information about you. There can even be, in some cases, a more straightforward additional data externality, where if you sell data, that data might be informative about me, for example, because we're friends, right? And if you sell data about which movies you like, that might be informative about which movies I have seen and so on. And again, I'm not getting compensated. And so as economists, we know that if we have these kind of externalities where some person's choice influences outcome for another person, but that person is not getting compensated the way that the first person is, usually we have to be quite careful about how well markets will work here at leading to an efficient outcome. And so in general, from an economic point of view, there's no general reason to expect that data ownership leads to better outcomes than regulation. Okay, that's a pretty strong statement that I'm telling you just on the basis of one weird story that I've made up about married people and unmarried people applying for jobs. And there are, of course, exceptions. So in some cases, data ownership actually does improve things quite a lot. So for example, if we talk about personalized pricing, so there's a nice paper by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman about to come out, I think, and they actually show that data ownership, so giving people ownership of their data, is beneficial if we talk about personalized pricing. So like Amazon offering you different prices depending on what they know about you. And the big reason for that is that when we talk about prices, we might be changing, which transactions are taking place, But in the end, a price just reshuffles money from one side to the other. So somebody's loss is always somebody else's gain. Okay, so if the price goes up that you pay, then somebody else will be making more money. But that kind of thing, somebody's loss is somebody else's gain, that is of course not true in general, right? And in our example with the married, unmarried people trying to get the job and the employer, discriminating, or the employer trying to make differences, there, as I've said, the hurt or the damage to the married people who cannot get the job might be much larger than the relatively small benefit of the employer. And then we might have other prices there, wages and so on. So things might be a bit more complicated, but in general, we should not expect that this exact holds. Okay, so now I've told you this story about regulation. And so now we can think, okay, so maybe we're convinced that one person's privacy or some people's privacy has implications both for those people, but also for others in society. We are maybe convinced that it has implications for, the distribution of surplus in society and inequality in society, and that it can hit, lack of privacy can hit minorities more than others, for example. And maybe we're even convinced that, okay, sometimes, just giving people ownership of their data and then stepping back, of course, it's not as simple as that. We would have to regulate also like what is ownership and who can trade it and so on. But just giving people ownership of their data and stepping back, we wouldn't necessarily expect that to automatically lead to the kind of outcomes that we want. So then, of course, the next obvious question is, how much regulation do we actually need, right? If we need some regulation, can we do a kind of light-handed approach, or do we actually need to choose relatively intrusive methods? So let me talk briefly about banks. So this is, kind of a story or just an example. So banks, when they make lending decisions, they would in principle be happy to use all kinds of data to do that, right? Because any kind of data, if you can get data about, the hobbies that people have or how much they exercise or all these kinds of things, all of this is in the end informative about how likely it is that that person will pay you back, right? Because if they go running 5 times a week, that means they have a longer life expectancy, and hence giving them a mortgage looks somewhat more promising. And that has led, for example, in the past to so-called redlining practices. Okay, and that really just means, you take a map of town and you draw red lines around some areas, and you say we're not lending to people in these areas. Okay, so that was especially prevalent in the US. And so these kind of obvious redlining practices are outlawed in many countries now. Okay, so for example, in the US already in the 1970s, but also in basically all other Western countries, these are outlined to some extent. So when you make lending decisions, you cannot take account of people's gender and people's skin color and a lot of these other things. So the dominant regulatory approach to this kind of thing has been what we could call blacklisting. Okay, so kind of saying you cannot use that data. Okay, so in general, you're free to use whatever data you want, but you cannot use data on gender, on often it's postcode, on where people were born, things like that. Okay, and that's one approach, and that's a relatively, if we think about it, it's a relatively light touch approach, right? Because we can say generally you can do whatever you want, but there are some things that are beyond that you cannot use, right? Just a few things. But big data, of course, now means that there's a lot of data that can be used for these kind of decisions. Okay, so for example, Facebook owns a patent on turning your data into credit scores. As far as I know, they're not doing that, but the patent is there. Okay, so the number is here. You can look it up. So they have the patent to do with it. They could start doing that at any time. And of course, Facebook has a lot of data about you that would be useful for credit scores. And there's also companies that directly offer this kind of social scoring. Okay, where they just say, all data is credit data. So this is a company called Zest Finance, and that was their slogan, right? So they just said, give us a name, and we'll find all kinds of data about that person, and we'll turn that into a credit score. So for example, what kind of sports people do, and what kind of other activities people do, or what kind of friends they have, and so on. And that, of course, means that if banks are not allowed to use data on race and gender, so this kind of blacklisting that I talked about, they can maybe just, ask a social scoring company to provide them some data on music taste and clothing purchases. But these things, of course, will be hugely correlated with the things that we don't want banks to work with, right? And where we kind of feel like this is not something that banks should be using, both for moral reasons, but also for the reasons I have illustrated earlier in the talk. So, for example, if you listen to rap music, or you listen to classical music, or if you buy skirts or not, at least outside of Scotland, that is hugely predictive about the things that we don't want banks to care about. And these decisions might be made by machine learning, right? So a lot of banks are now experimenting with, having kind of, black box machine learning algorithms and so on, where we might not even understand what is going on, right? So at least if it's a person, we can ask them, well, what did you base your decision on? If it's just some machine learning algorithm, they might base all of their decision on who is buying skirts and who is listening to rap music, and we might never actually find out, right? So if into these decisions, people are using sufficiently large, sufficiently complex data sets, that can outflank these simple blacklisting regulations that we have, have had for about 50 years to get around these worst problems of redlining and so on. And so in these situations, we can see that actually simple blacklisting might not accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here in this world of big data and huge data availability, and everything can be connected by your name and so on. So one alternative to this is, of course, whitelisting, okay, where we go and, as a regulator, we go to banks or insurance companies or so, and we say, when you make decisions about who to lend to or who can buy insurance at what price, you are only allowed to use these types of data. You are only allowed to use data on, past payment history and educational history or something like that, but you're not allowed to use anything else regardless of what it is. And that is, of course, even stronger regulation. So I'm not saying that this is what needs to be done in every case, but I'm trying to explain, with the help of these stories and examples, how we can see an economic justification for these kind of things, and how we can see that other things might not accomplish what we're actually trying to accomplish here. Okay, so again, I think it's time for me to conclude. So I started with this statement that said, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And I said, is that actually a good way of looking at this? And now I've told you some stories and some examples, and we should note that in none of these examples was there anyone who actually had anything to hide, really, right? I mean, having a Polish last name, or being against Brexit, or being married, or listening to a certain kind of music, that is not something that we consider, as something that you want to hide, or that you should hide or something. But still, privacy and who had access to that kind of data clearly mattered, okay, for the individual and for society, for economic outcomes that we really care about, right? Who gets which job, who gets which loan, who can buy which insurance at which price. These are really outcomes that we are really concerned with in economics. And so in the end, I think these examples that I've given you, they lead to some provocative questions. Okay, so that kind of maybe I want to leave you with, and that maybe will be interesting to think about. So the first one is, if privacy helps minorities, does that make it more or less important, right? Does that mean that we say, well, I mean, it mostly matters for a relatively small group, so we don't actually care that much about it? Or do we say, well, it matters a lot for a group who is already disadvantaged and whom we are already trying to help, and so we actually care more about privacy once we understand that? Secondly, relatively straightforward, is then, what is actually privacy's role in increasing and narrowing inequality? Okay, so we've seen how it can affect different groups differently. Of course, it can also just shift economic surplus between different groups. Okay, so if we give people who apply for jobs, if we try to give them more privacy, at least in the short run, that might just make the employer better off, and some people who apply, might make the employer worse off, and some people who apply better off and some people who apply worse off, right? Because now different people who apply for the same job get lumped together that otherwise wouldn't have been lumped together if there was more information about them. So can we leave it to markets, or do we need intrusive regulations? I've given you some arguments, but that's of course not the end of the discussion. Because if the market cannot do it well, or if small, like non-intrusive regulations cannot do it well, that doesn't of course mean that regulations will be well made, or regulations will be well executed, or regulations will be very successful at doing better than that. We know from economic theory that there are some informational problems that just cannot be overcome by any kind of mechanism. And finally, if we want to regulate, can we just blacklist and outlaw bad practices and just say, once we realize something bad is going on, we just say, no, you're no longer supposed to do that? Or do we actually sometimes need to install relatively narrow guardrails and say, this is what you can do and not much else? So I think that's all I want to say. So I will switch off my presentation here, if I can figure out how to do that, and stop sharing and get back to, here we are. Yes, very good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Uli. That was really informative and incredibly clear. So thank you as well for all the stories to illustrate the kind of the economic theory that kind of lies in the background. So I'm going to start us off actually with a couple of questions around, so this lack of demand, this kind of privacy puzzle that you started with at the beginning, and trying to think a little bit more about why is it that we have a kind of surprising lack of demand in some respects for individuals taking actions to protect their privacy, when in certain scenarios they're going to express a kind of positive willingness to pay for it. And one thing I was wondering is about dynamic aspects to privacy. So the fact that, and there's kind of in a sense the right to be forgotten for different data about you to be erased, if you like, from certain records. Because it seems that at the point at which we're kind of consuming particular services, this might be more of an issue if we think about social media. There's going to be potential timing mismatches between when I'm providing information or data or disclosing information about myself. I might have had the conversation about Brexit, a couple of years before I'm thinking about applying. Particular job, and how does that have you thought about that mismatch? Do you think that's important for thinking about regulation, or why when markets might or might not work?
So I think that's a very important point, and something really important about this data is that data is very long-lived, right? Data is basically infinitely lived. But when at the moment where we're giving away data, we're often not really taking account of that, right? So I mean, the most extreme example is some 14-year-old teenager who signs up to some social media site or so and sees all this privacy explanations and so on, and just things like what is anyone going to do with this data, and why do I care, and so on. But of course, at some point, this 14-year-old will be 30 or 40 years old and will have a lot of money and maybe in a powerful position, and then of course having all kinds of data about them is very important and is very valuable, and so I think this is partially something where it is interesting, I think, also for empirical research to try to understand people's risk preferences. Right? Because what we're really talking about here is expectations about the future and thinking about how valuable will that data become in the future. And of course, everyone at every point where we make decisions, there are several different life paths for us. And in one of them, the data will be super valuable. The data that we're generating now, the discussion about Brexit that we're having now, will be very valuable to someone who wants to hire us for a job where this is a central piece of information or so, or we become a politician or something. And in other life paths, it will not be very important, right? And so I think one of the explanations for this kind of privacy paradox is that we don't really have a very good understanding of how people think about this risk, but also I think people are just not very used to thinking about that risk, right? So I don't think we should necessarily look at that and say, people are obviously already making the optimal decisions, and it's just on us to understand that. Right?
So one of the reasons that you spoke about in terms of, well, in a sense, why kind of a market approach is going to be difficult is because of these externalities in terms of, you know, even if I might want to keep my data to myself, firms are going to be learning about me from disclosure by others. And so there's a question about, is it possible really to think about restrictions on the use of other people's data to make inferences about me? So the question is would an alternative route be, basically setting up more kind of silos or restrictions in the use of individually disclosed data? And do you think, imagine if that was possible, would it be possible to, we think, have functioning data rights, property rights in that case?
So that's a very good question, because that is, of course, a major complication with that kind of thing. And a lot of the data that we talk about, I mean, we also need to understand what kind of data are we talking about, right? Because often the data will not be just, you know, I have bought this at that point, but the data will also be about connections, and both, I mean, you know, my name being connected with certain actions, but also my name being connected with other names. And I think a lot of the research at Facebook shows that that is actually very predictive about a lot of these things. And so I think it's very hard to do this well. And this is another point where kind of, you know, what I've said in the talk also, that, you know, sometimes we just have to consider relatively blunt things, right? Because these very targeted things where we say, like, no, your data is protected, but all of your friends' data is traded freely and so on, and you're not affected by that. That is often not the case, and that often doesn't work. So that really, this kind of interconnected nature of data, and also these correlations, so there's a difference between the correlation and the fact that I just reveal information by not selling data, right? But both of these things pose a big big challenge to this kind of easy fixes.
And someone else has asked about, is it correct to think about personalized pricing that sometimes this disclosure is facilitating as really a form of price discrimination? And so is this all actually, like, you know, actually in terms of, you mentioned both efficiency and equity issues, but really I think they're challenging to say, actually, can some of this be efficient, challenging you, I think, a bit on the efficiency point.
Yeah. So this is, and you know, the paper I mentioned in the talk there, which of course is, I mean, much more theoretical than anything I talked today, but that's, I think it's about to come out or to be published maybe this year or maybe even next year, right? So they're still in the publication process. So this is a really hot topic of debate and research, right? So kind of under what circumstances, and we might be a bit surprised by that, right? Because if we look at it, it seems like a relatively obvious question once we think about asymmetric information and efficiency and so on, right? But a lot of these questions, because what goes into it is, for example, assumptions about what kind of data do you have and what does the data look like and so on. So a lot of this research has been informed by how things are developing now. And so there's a lot of research on this being done now, and there are kind of credible arguments that really, if the only thing you're doing is to increase the chance that trades where both sides benefit take place, because there's always the problem, if we have very little information, there's always the problem that people might just not trade because of informational problems, right? So someone quotes a very high price and the other one says, no, not at that price. Whereas if they knew a little bit more about each other, they would have been able to trade because they would have set prices that are kind of closer to what they're willing to pay. So we're always, if the only thing we're doing is solving these problems, and then by prices shifting money between different people, then we can kind of see that on the efficiency side, at least, this kind of personalized pricing can improve things. On the equity side, of course, that's far less than clear, right? But yeah, so I mean, I invite, so I mean, this work is far from done, right? I mean, and there's papers being written now by people from, you know, Stanford and all the good universities on these kind of things, Oxford as well. And so this is something that is an active area of research. So I'm not giving, I mean, on none of these things am I giving any final answers, of course.
Very good. Just because you mentioned the difference, if you like, between blacklisting and whitelisting at the end of your talk. And I was just wondering, could you talk a little bit more about what whitelisting would kind of mean in practice, do you think? Or have you seen any successful examples of that in terms of how regulators are approaching these issues already?
Yeah, so I mean, in the extreme case, that would really be to say you can only use that kind of data. And so I'm not an expert on that, but my understanding is that so credit ratings is an important thing there, right? So how are credit ratings constructed? And there are some countries that have, so some continental European countries that have pretty strong rules about that say, you know, credit ratings can only really be based on these 3 pieces of information or something, right? And actually, I think that's relatively widespread, this kind of regulation. And then, of course, the question is, you know, the next step is then to say, you know, to do another step of whitelisting and say only credit ratings can go into the lending decision, right? Because, I mean, if credit ratings can only be based on these 3 things, but then any kind of other information can also go into the lending decision, then we're kind of again in a situation where we're kind of outflanking that. So I think for credit ratings, I think also for some, so now I'm just mixing together very different examples, but I think for some medical decisions about transplants or so, these kind of rules are sometimes used that say you can only really base it on these medically relevant things, and you cannot, you know, do as a doctor do like a whole like kind of holistic assessment and just say I like that person, I don't like that other person also, right? You kind of have to very clearly justify, and there's a catalog of criteria that can be used for that.
Just had another really interesting question come in about how we think about the monetary, how would we think about conceptualizing and also estimating the monetary cost of privacy regulations? And I'm also going to throw in how we think about putting a number maybe on the benefits of privacy. So the precise kind of the justification that this person's given is saying, you know, in some sense there's you know, there are productivity hits to continually trying to like opt out of cookies, you know, et cetera. Yeah, how can we think about like what the cost of that is?
Yeah, so that, I mean, for the productivity hits of just having to opt out and so on, I think it's relatively straightforward because, I mean, time has value and so on. But I think the more important things are these kind of more abstract effects that I was talking about, which is that, for example, you know, people are not as outspoken on social media as they would otherwise be. Or also, you know, if insurance companies use social media, people just only post about their running and their sports all the time, and pictures of themselves eating carrots and so on, right? And on social media just becomes, you know, like a page where you go to see people eating carrots. So these costs are very, very hard to quantify, right? Because basically we would have to find out how much do people care about engaging with their friends or using social media and being connected to their friends and so on without these restrictions, and then how much do they change it and how much is that cost. So that's something that's very hard to quantify, and where also, I mean, I'm not an empirical researcher, so I don't have, this is also not my expertise, but this is something where there are a lot of open questions. Let me say something else about quantifiability and also, so I think also the talk last time, the last month that you had, I think the speaker said we should also say something positive. So we should also say something positive, of course, what these huge amounts of data can allow, right? So I showed you this example in the beginning where you know, you can apply at Google or no application necessary, or we already have all the data. And something like that actually happened to me when I was living in Denmark. You know, Denmark has a very modern administrative system. You know, everything is in the same database. All citizens' data is kept in the same database. That's actually how I started getting interested in these privacy questions, because I thought that's insane. I mean, if you come from the background from other countries. But so Denmark has this very generous system for supporting students. So, you can get paid for studying. So education is free, and then you can get paid for studying. And the way you apply for that is you just log in on the government's website and you click on apply. That's it. Because they already know what you're studying. They know how old you are. They know where you live. They know who your parents are. They have all your tax returns. So they know how many assets you have in the bank. You don't need to fill out a single form. You just click on apply, and then they have all the information. And then very quickly, because all of the information is already in their database, so they don't have to, scan in stuff or so, very quickly you actually get the decision. And that is, of course, something that is a bit easier to quantify, because that saves me, 5 to 7 hours of work if I have the papers there. If I first need to go, to the commune where I was born or whatever to get those documents, then that can be a lot more than that, right? And so these some of these advantages of keeping a lot of data in one place, we can also quantify, and we should not be silent about them. I mean, the talk today, of course, was about privacy, so it's kind of the only one side of that, but we should also mention these things that we can sometimes and sometimes not quantify.
On that point, in terms of, I guess, like kind of, yeah, okay, so I agree there are like huge benefit. I mean, I'm an empirical researcher, so I can see often, even if I'm not personally making tons of money off it, like my research output, I also get a lot of benefit from understanding more, being able to analyze data about how individuals going out and kind of living their lives. One thing I was wondering a little bit about, though, is when you think about what some of the data facilitates in terms of potentially moving away from, say, humans having to make individual decisions on the basis of, say, soft information in front of them, to potential automation of decisions on the basis of data that's been disclosed. Have you seen anything in terms of what does this mean in terms of like the correlation of the types of decisions that are made? So imagine for your university application example, so as the amount of data that those decisions are being made on the basis of increases, and you have a substitution of human, if you like, for kind of algorithmic decision making. Does that also, I mean, I'm not sure if this is a theory question or this is probably an applied question, but does that then mean that I'm more likely to get the same answer in terms of, do I get into this university or that university? There's going to be greater correlation basically in how that works across different actors, and maybe with that we might be more worried about that when we start thinking about your banking examples in terms of access to credit or something, that then suddenly individuals end up getting shut out, not just from one bank, but from the kind of all lending options, because of the kind of the homogeneity of the data that's being made, this information, that there's more correlation, I guess, and just like the errors. Does that come up at all in any of the theoretical work, or is that kind of seen as a more of an applied question?
So that's one thing. I think we would somewhat expect competition to work a bit against that, right? Okay. So because, I mean, we still have different banks competing and so on, but something that we should, of course, be worried about is, what do these algorithms learn? And because all of these algorithms in the end need to be, trained by humans. So they get a lot of data about actual decisions made by humans. And then the algorithms just try to figure out, machine learning or neural networks or whatever. They just try to figure out, what are the criteria that have been used there. And so you can just go to Google and enter AI racist, and you will find a lot of news stories where, people have been trying to replace or use algorithms in, making, sentencing decisions or lending decisions or admission decisions or all these kind of things. And they give the algorithm a large training data set of past decisions, and the algorithm somehow figures out to look at criteria that we actually don't want to be used, right? And it's kind of, and then again, so again, we can, either blacklist or whitelist. It's a bit easier with these algorithms because we really control what goes into them, at least if they don't go Googling on their own and so on. But this is really a very tricky thing, and this is often something that we don't really have very good control over, right? And there's, I mean, people from computer science and people from ethics and sociology and so on. Everyone is working on these questions, of course.
Well, I have the final question is more of a philosophical one from the Q&A. So the question I think I want to finish on is, does kind of personalization and nudging that some of this disclosure of information kind of facilitates, do we think about that as constituting a kind of threat to our autonomy? And I'm going to add on to that, do we think that as economists we've always taken the right lens in terms of the analysis of what the costs and benefits are, I guess, of privacy, and should economists also be thinking perhaps about autonomy, or do we think about other values in your work?
So I think there's two things here in a way, right? So one is that, so when I said in the beginning, there's other definitions. And so one definition is to talk about privacy as, like discussing the boundary between yourself and the world and so on, something. So I think that's an important perspective, and that's also a wider perspective, but that's not necessarily a perspective that we can really contribute to very much with economic thinking all the time, right? On the other hand, I think something that economics has going for it there is that what I also said in the talk, which is that we take preferences quite seriously, right? So we don't tend to go and tell people, this is a bad preference. You should not have that preference. We will treat you as if you had a different preference because we don't think you should have that preference also, right? We tend to take preferences quite seriously. So while I don't think, so you mentioned at the beginning, right, that the big project that I have here at Chance University is called Data Algorithms Power Economic Theories of the Information Society, right? And the power is not electricity, but is really power over what do people do and what kind of power does data give us. And one reason for that is that I think as economists, we don't have very good tools or theoretical tools to think about some of these questions of autonomy and power. So that's kind of, I think, one of the directions in which also I want to move with this kind of research. And where I think, as I said, so I think we have some things going for us. So we're not, we tend to take people seriously. We tend to take preferences seriously, but we have some things speaking against that, right? We kind of tend to be a bit, blasé or a bit, neglectful towards some of these questions of coercion and like forcing people to do something that they don't want to do. And then we say, oh, but, in the end, they were given an alternative of, doing this or starving. So in the end, it was their own free choice, right? So this is something that as economists, we don't always have very good tools of thinking about that. So this is a very interesting question, and something where I think also economists can really learn from philosophers and others as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ole, for that super fascinating presentation and answering all of the questions. We've got so there'll be many comments, thanking you in the Q&A as well. And to those of you who've asked for maybe some of the maths behind what Ole was talking about, when we distribute the recording for this, or where we'll post the recording, we'll also try and we'll include some further reading and a link to Ole's webpage so you can keep up to date with the outputs from his project, which is also looking at power. But thank you so much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to seeing all of you next month for the next in the series. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Very nice to have this chance. Thank you.